All right, and I'm going to present here. No, sorry. All right. So this is section 2 of chapter 1. All right. So hopefully you guys can see that. All right. You guys see that? Does anybody not see that? All right. Okay. All right. So yesterday, introducing the course and the chapter here, we're just basically kind of going over some terms and this idea, just kind of what civics is, what government is, concept of ideals and values, rights and responsibilities, and those are things that we'll kind of come back to periodically when we talk about things like amendments and stuff like that. So today and tomorrow, what I want to do here is I want to do a little history. And so just kind of like, because in a sense here, when we talk about which section 2 is who are U.S. citizens, who makes up the citizenry and the population of the United States. We are a country that is essentially, I'm sure you probably heard that before, it's kind of we're a nation of immigrants, right? And so immigration plays a big role in who we are as kind of, and how our values and ideals are kind of shaped. And it's still like an issue that's, it's still an issue that kind of permeates our kind of political sphere today. So your standard kind of textbook definition for immigration is the movement of people from one nation to another. All right, those who leave their home country to settle in another country, we tend to refer to as immigrants. All right, or immigrants, sometimes spelled with an E, if you will. Again, we're a nation that, like, compared to kind of like, other parts of the world, we're a relatively young nation. All right. And so in early part of our history, we encouraged needed immigration in a sense to not just populate the country, but to essentially kind of grow economically and things of that nature. All right. Now, historically, when you guys were probably like in grade school or something like that, you probably did like a unit on like Native Americans. All right. And so this is, and this could be debatable here. I have them kind of included in this kind of story of immigration here, where you could argue that when they say migrated is kind of moving from region to region. Obviously, when we have the Native Americans, when they settle and kind of cross what they call the land bridge known as Bergenia, where the Bering Strait is connecting, separating Asia, Russia, if you will, and North America, Alaska. Obviously, the United States wasn't a country here. All right, but to kind of include this here in the discussion, as a sense here, these what we classify Native Americans were kind of migrating, looking essentially for game. Mastodon, woolly mammoth, all that other stuff. And like from your previous, knowledge of this, they eventually started kind of settled throughout the Americas, what we refer to as the Americas. All right. So again, this is like somewhat debatable. Do we include this in the story of migration? I have it included here. All right. And so this up there in green there says Bergenia. This was during the last major ice age, about 18 million years ago or whatever. So this is again, and there's some debatable whether, this has been challenged at certain times. There may be some evidence from fossil remains eastwardly, kind of coming from the east, if you will. But this is again, you guys probably had a unit here on Native Americans. All right. And then, after the Native Americans kind of settled throughout after the last major ice age, and that what we classify this, the first Europeans reach the Americas, the Norse, where we more commonly refer to them as Vikings. Viking was a specific form and the Norse were an ethnic group that inhabited Scandinavia, places today, like modern day countries of Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, places like that. And a guy named Leif Erikson eventually kind of led an expedition from what was Greenland to the kind of eastern shore of Canada in what they call Newfoundland. For a brief period of time, the Vikings had a settlement they referred to as Vinland. So this is somewhat almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus. The Vikings, though, didn't leave a lasting. Vinland was only a short period of time for settlement. Eventually, the Vikings had, for whatever reasons, and there's various reasons, had essentially kind of abandoned this settlement. But if you go to Newfoundland, if you ever may have a chance to go to Newfoundland, and this is the kind of migration pattern here. You'll see they have remnants of kind of like dwellings and recreation of kind of like Viking dwellings and things of that nature. All right. But they never landed on what is like continental United States. All right. And then in world history, we have a period in history, we're talking in the kind of late 15th, 16th to 17th centuries, what they call the Age of Exploration. All right. And the first Europeans to make settlements in what we refer to as in America, and the Americas were the Spanish. Right. And we all know the story of kind of Christopher Columbus and that, but Columbus never stepped foot on what is the United States of America. Right. He made 4 expeditions where he landed in places like the Bahamas, Jamaica, along the kind of the coastline of kind of the Mosquito Coast and around Nicaragua and in northern part of South America. The Spanish do make an establishment in the 1600s. Still around today. If you ever go down to Florida, St. Augustine, Florida is considered the oldest European settlement in the United States. And they still have a replica of the kind of the Spanish style fort that was down there. All right. And the Spanish had made their kind of colonial possessions in places like Texas, American Southwest. And so we have other Europeans that kind of compete for kind of territory in these areas to kind of open up new trade routes and things of that nature. So this is an example of what they call an angle bastion fort. This is at St. Augustine, Florida. You could go there. It's a kind of a national park site, if you will. And then other kind of Europeans that would soon follow after that made settlements in in what is essentially the United States. The French claimed much of this region, the Mississippi Valley, kind of stretching from what is essentially Quebec into Canada all the way down to New Orleans. They refer to that as part of what we call New France. So like around here, if you ever go down to Randolph County, there's a place called Fort de Chartres. That was a French fort down there. All right. The British claimed much of the eastern seaboard. We're talking what we will later refer to as the kind of 13 colonies. The Dutch, those from Netherlands, even got into the colonies competition. Their main area there was like kind of up by New York. Matter of fact, New York City was once known as New Amsterdam. All right. It was a Dutch settlement purchased from the native populations there. And then the British purchased it from the Dutch, renamed it after the King of England at the time, his brother, who was the Duke of York. All right. And so with the Spanish in the Southwest and that, we see kind of Europeans kind of staking claim. Now, these Europeans at this time were in competition with one another. So this is a kind of geography, and we're talking in the beginning of the 18th century, 1700s. In green were the French, and then you see kind of in pink were the British. So the French, the British, and the Spanish are all kind of like in a staring contest for the most part. Unfortunately, at times, where one's claim begins, the other one ends, and a lot of European history played a role in that. But all of them were bringing in, you had settlers from these places that would come there. Some were indentured servants that would work for their freedom. Others kind of made settlements there for like religious purposes and things of that nature, pilgrims and such. One group that is kind of tied in with this kind of age of exploration and colonization that did not necessarily have a kind of say in their migration were Africans. All right. And so while these colonies start to develop in these places, we start to see the emergence of the what we call the slave trade. All right. And so you would have Europeans that would go to Africa, trade with other African kingdoms, like the kingdoms of Benin and places like that. They would acquire slaves. They would have the slaves work on these large plantations for the Portuguese in Brazil, for the Spanish in the Caribbean, and French and all that in Haiti. And then they would sell kind of finished products in Europe. So the Middle Passage is often referred to as the terrible trip those slaves were kind of forced to make. All right. And so this is like, there was something called the 1619 Project that was just recently out that kind of associated with this kind of era here. All right. So I'm going to attempt to kind of play this short little video from History Channel here, talking about the concept, the Middle Passage, if you will. I need to mute my mic though, because there may be a little bit of kind of backup here. So let me mute that.
From about 1525 to 1866, 12.5 million Africans were taken from their homeland and forcibly transported across the Atlantic, a journey that approximately 2 million of them would not survive. By the turn of the 18th century, European merchants were building vessels capable of transporting hundreds of enslaved people per journey. These ships had extra portholes for ventilation, weapons mounted on deck in case of rebellion, and additional compartments added below deck to take on more human cargo. Before boarding the ships at African port cities, enslaved people were stripped of their clothing and remaining possessions and had their heads forcibly shaved. During boarding, which could take weeks or even months, enslaved people lived on the deck of the ship in a temporary wooden house constructed by the crew. The crew also installed netting around the deck of the ship, designed to catch those enslaved who might opt for death over forced servitude. Once moved below deck, enslaved people would find themselves stuffed into compartments with ceilings as low as 4.5 feet, where they would spend most of their voyage. They were segregated by gender and age. Adult men were kept separately and shackled in pairs. Women usually left unchained in their designated compartment, and children often free to move about the ship. There were no sanitary facilities of any kind. Enslaved people were forced to relieve themselves where they sat, creating hellish conditions when combined with the heat and lack of ventilation below deck. Disease was rampant. Dysentery, malaria, yellow fever, smallpox, measles, and influenza ravaged the enslaved and crew members alike. The enslaved people generally spent about 8 hours a day above deck, but were still separated by gender, with a barricado, a reinforced wall that could be used to protect crew members in case of a revolt. Enslaved people were also subject to forced exercise, which sometimes included dance and song for the entertainment of the crew. Enslaved captives deemed disobedient were tortured and beaten, usually whipped with the especially cruel cat-o'-nine tails, a tool designed to inflict maximum pain. Enslaved people who refused to eat their typical meal of rice and beans were forced to do so, sometimes with a speculum oris, a medieval tool used to force open a person's mouth. Women, while usually left unshackled, were raped and sexually abused by members of the crew, sometimes arriving in the New World, carrying the children of their attackers. But it was the women, using their minuscule freedoms, who would often coordinate mutinies against their captors. But these rebellions were rarely successful. The true extent of the horrors of the Middle Passage came to light in a 1783 court trial over the slave ship Zong. The Zong left present-day Ghana in August of 1781 with 442 enslaved on board. After a 2-month journey riddled with navigation errors, 62 enslaved people and 7 crew members had perished without reaching their destination. Disease was spreading throughout the ship, and fresh water was running dangerously low. Captain Luke Collingwood was afraid of the financial cost of more deaths. Enslaved people that died of disease were not covered by the ship's insurance, but the enslaved who drowned were. Collingwood ordered approximately 130 enslaved people thrown overboard. He claimed it was necessary to do so to halt the spread of disease. At the trial between the Zong's owners and their insurance company, the owners argued that because it was legal to kill sick animals for the health of a ship, it was legal to treat enslaved people the same. The court agreed with the ship's owners, but the trial itself exposed the horrors aboard the Zong, and its story was republished by British abolitionists with the name of the ship redacted, meant to show that this tragedy could happen on any ship transporting enslaved people across the Middle Passage. 24 years after the Zong trial, the international slave trade was outlawed in both Great Britain and the United States. It would take England an additional 26 years and the U.S. another 58 years plus a civil war before the practice of slavery was officially abolished.
Okay. All right. So, and again, like, you know,
From about 1525.
Oops, sorry. So, like I said, this is all part of what they call the kind of triangular trade. Europeans kind of getting slaves from what they call the Gold Coast, the slave coast, bringing them to the New World to work on plantations for sugar cane, coffee, things of that nature, tobacco, and then they would kind of, these products would kind of go back to Europe and into the new markets, into Africa and places like that. So it's this is something that we have to deal with as in our history. It is it's part of it here. And so this was a slave ship called the Brooks that broke all records for basically transporting slaves. It basically was supposed to, I think, fit like something like 300 slaves. It had about 600 in its hull and that. And so, this is going to tie in later as we kind of talk about like kind of amendments and, like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and the concept of like how our ideals match up with liberty and freedom and stuff like that. But then here, like, we also, like, as a nation of immigrants, like I said, we're a country that kind of encouraged immigration for our early history, in the sense for populating the country and that. And we would have various waves of immigration. So like the first wave of immigration soon after independence up until the kind of later part of the 19th century, most of those immigrants that were kind of coming to the United States were from Northern and Western Europe. This is kind of like the kind of pattern. And most of them were Protestant. All right. And so you had people coming from places, like England, Scotland, Germany, places like that. One exception to the rule were the Irish. The Irish were primarily coming over as Roman Catholics. And there's also a number of what we call push-pull factors. Why do people leave places? The kind of the pull factor are things that are attractive, like to work. We're basically trying to encourage people to come as we were industrializing. And then another one was like kind of push factors, things like the potato famine that kind of forced a lot of Irish, what they call a diaspora. All right. So majority of them kind of starting after like kind of the 1840s, if you will, a little bit before that. And then the second wave of immigration, 1880s, early part of the 19th century, 1920s. This tends to be a little different. We still have immigration coming from Northern and Western Europe, but we start to see more immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Places like Italy and Collinsville obviously benefits from that. Places like the Balkans, those areas in Southeastern Europe. We see from Asia, Japan, China, Latin America as well. And so there's various kind of entry points here into the United States. Because this was a period where we were industrializing pretty quickly. So we were encouraging people to kind of come here. So one of the most famous entry points is in the kind of the harbor between New York and New Jersey, and that's Ellis Island. All right. And Ellis Island became this example of kind of almost like industrializing this concept of how you bring people into this country. All right. And so there today it's a museum. I don't know if anyone's been able to go to it. And obviously, kind of in the distance there, you see the Statue of Liberty, which was the first thing that a lot of people would see as they came into the harbor there with the famous poem, give me your tired, your poor, your hunger messes, yearning to breathe free, and stuff like that. And so a lot of these immigrants were poor. There was a lot of push factors for leaving their home countries to come to America, but they were kind of processed in almost like a cattle kind of situation here. And so what you would have is a lot of times people would be checked out I'm gonna skip this video here if you don't mind. Oh, let me kind of go here.
And
People were checked out to kind of make sure that they were bringing in diseases like trachoma, which was a kind of an eye disease that was pretty common, and also to see if they didn't have any kind of extremist views or whatever from back home and such. So there's a lot of people that were turned away. All right. One group, like I was saying, there's a number of push factors. One group that had a major push factor during the second wave were Jews. All right. And the Jewish communities in places like Russia and Poland were dealing with what they call pogroms, which were these kind of like attacks that were sometimes basically sponsored by the government, encouraged by these governments here, the Tsarist government, Russia, and that where Jewish communities were targeted. And so, in a sense, historically, many Jews had been kind of wandering around. They would kind of leave Europe. They would migrate to places when historically they were persecuted for various reasons. And in the 1800s, the United States was a new option for them. So, like in St. Louis and West County, there's a Jewish museum, like a Holocaust museum there, that was funded by many Jews in kind of St. Louis. Comes from Eastern Europe and Russia, and kind of trace their heritage back there. All right, and so this is a kind of a cartoon in the early part of the 20th century, kind of showing Teddy Roosevelt in the kind of top left corner, kind of admonishing the Tsar, basically showing him, like the oppression that he has to give it to Jews. But Jewish community kind of like there was a number of kind of people migrated to the United States. We start to see a pushback on people, and this kind of happens, unfortunately, kind of traditionally in the United States, and still an issue here where there's a pushback on people who perceive all this immigration as a threat to their kind of version of what America is. We see a movement start to emerge, even in the early, kind of during the first wave of immigration. We start to see a lot of Irish coming in, called nativism. This is the idea that America should be preserved for native-born Americans. That doesn't mean Native Americans. That means basically, in the sense, their definition being kind of white Northern European Protestants, if you will. There's even a political party that was kind of established as that, called the American Party. They're often referred to as the know-nothing parties. The know-nothings, because when people would ask about their political affiliation, people would say, I don't know nothing. And so this party dedicated a lot of its platform to anti-immigration. If you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, there's a character in the Bill Butcher who's a member of the American Party. All right. And so you would see, again, the flag kind of co-opted for these kind of reasons here. All right. You would have a number of kind of media outlets that would have these kind of like, these kind of nativist positions, like the American Citizens and that, and with these grandiose terms like American Patriot, stuff like that. They kind of use stereotypes. This was kind of image here of Irish. And so a lot of this, you would have like, populations that maybe could not read, but they could read, they can kind of interpret a cartoon, if you will. And then we start to see a number of kind of what we kind of exclusion acts start to emerge here. The first exclusion act in American history was the Chinese Exclusion Act here in 1882, which was later also adding in like Japan and that. This halted immigration to China for a number of years. Is kind of renewed under various terms. The Chinese were kind of chosen, kind of cited because they culturally, physically, they were a target to those who were nativists. However, much of the kind of in the American West, the rail system that connected this country was built with a lot of Chinese and Irish labor. All right, and so and like this was, you would see. Like this was actually an ad for a washing, like a detergent company that was based out of Dixon, Illinois. This was in a newspaper. This was their ad, basically, because the number of Chinese had worked in the kind of laundry industry. So this is, again, kind of the nativism kind of rearing its ugly head, if you will. And then in the 1920s, the early part of 1920s, this is where we see a lot of like kind of what we call quota acts. A quota is just basically a limitation on something. So the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 essentially restricted the number of immigrants from any country by a year to 3% of the number of residents from that same country living in the United States as of the census of 1910. In a sense, this is basically you take account of population. So if you had, let's say, 40,000 immigrants from France, or let's say you had 40,000 immigrants from Italy or whatever like that, you would take 3% of that, and that 3% would be the number that could be allowed into this country. All right. So it was basically kind of what we call limitation, if you will. All right. And then another one was kind of added here was the Immigration Act of 1924, which is basically just kind of expands upon the previous Immigration Act, Quote Act. This one limited it to 2%, dropped the percentage down, and moved the kind of the data that we're using back to the 1890 census. Therefore, there'll be fewer amounts of people living in that time than there were in 1910. All right. So this is something, again, a lot of times, like they say, history repeats itself. This is something in the United States that we are constantly kind of like this kind of pushing and pulling in that of these things. So I'm going to leave this one up tomorrow, and then we're going to continue on into the kind of the second half of the section. All right. So I'm going to exit this, if you don't mind. All right. I'll stop there. All right. So we'll meet again here tomorrow. Remember, like, kind of submit the notes. If you happen to fall asleep or you didn't get all the notes, I will post the recording of this on Google Classroom later today. Sound good, guys?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Everybody have a good day. All right.